In the second half of the 20th century, both Japan and Italy set out to build world-class automobiles. Both countries had the engineering talent and manufacturing ambition necessary to compete globally. They both succeeded in creating vehicles that defined their eras. However, when you examine market share, financial stability, and production volumes today, the outcomes look remarkably different. This isn't a story about talent or intention. It's a story about which structural choices compound over decades and which ones don't. Japanese automotive engineering culture emerged from specific historical constraints. Post-war capital scarcity meant that mistakes had real consequences. Limited natural resources meant that waste was unacceptable. The dense geography meant that space was at a premium. These conditions did not reward improvisation. They rewarded systems. The focus wasn't simply on quality, it was on quality as something reproducible. The underlying premise was straightforward. If you can't reliably repeat something, then you don't actually control it. This led to obsessive documentation, standardization of work sequences, and continuous measurement of variance. The goal wasn't to build one exceptional car. The goal was to build the same car to the same standard 10,000 times in a row. Kaizen, or continuous improvement, became doctrine. Not because improvement sounded inspiring, but because small, measured iterations reduced risk. You can't overhaul an entire assembly process overnight. First, you identify the constraint. Then, you modify one variable, measure the result, standardize the improvement, and move to the next bottleneck. Progress accumulates slowly but predictably. Over the course of 20 years, this approach improves more than just vehicles. It also improves the people building them and the systems they operate within. Italy's automotive tradition developed under entirely different assumptions. Here, engineering wasn't separate from art, it was applied art. The curve of a roofline wasn't just for aerodynamics, it was an expression of style. The sound of an engine wasn't just a byproduct of combustion efficiency, it was a form of identity expression. Italian design houses believed that cars should evoke emotion first and serve a function second. In other words, emotion itself was a legitimate function. This wasn't carelessness, it was a different definition of value. While Japanese manufacturers prioritized reliability over time, Italian manufacturers prioritized impact in the moment. A sports car from Maranello wasn't designed to remain identical after 250,000 kilometers. It was designed to be unforgettable for the first kilometer. The philosophy accepted trade-offs that process-driven cultures couldn't tolerate. Higher variability, lower volumes, manual craftsmanship that didn't scale cleanly. The design-first approach assumed that excellence in aesthetics would justify complexity elsewhere. If the proportions were perfect, if the materials were exquisite, if the driving experience delivered something transcendent, then occasional mechanical temperament became acceptable, even romantic. Owners didn't just buy vehicles, they bought relationships, with objects that required attention, understanding, care. Both philosophies are internally coherent. Each makes sense within its own logic. The question isn't which theory sounds better. Rather, the question is, what happens when theory meets the industrial reality of producing complex machines on a large scale? Automobiles are unforgiving products. They consist of thousands of components, each with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters and each dependent on dozens of others. They operate in extreme conditions, such as temperature swings, vibration, corrosion, and impact. They're used by people with varying levels of mechanical aptitude, maintained inconsistently, and expected to function reliably for years. This isn't furniture. This is engineering as an endurance test. Process-driven manufacturing addresses this reality by systematically reducing risk. Each component has a specification. Each assembly step has a procedure. Any defect triggers a root cause analysis. When something fails, the entire process is examined to identify why the failure occurred and to ensure that it won't happen again. The system learns from every mistake. This approach creates compounding momentum. A manufacturer that eliminates one defect per 1,000 units one year, another the next year, and so on, will eventually reach defect rates that competitors can't match without rebuilding their entire production culture. The advantage accumulates. It's not visible in a single vehicle. It becomes visible across fleets, across years, across millions of units. Cost control follows similar logic. When every step is standardized, efficiency improvements apply universally. A 5-second reduction in one assembly step, multiplied across 3 shifts, 6 days weekly, 50 weeks annually for a decade, represents thousands of hours reclaimed. Those hours translate directly into cost advantage, or alternatively, into capacity to absorb complexity elsewhere without raising prices. Design-driven manufacturing operates differently. The focus remains on achieving a specific aesthetic or performance outcome, with production methods adjusted to serve that vision. If a particular curve requires hand forming, you hand form it. If a specific material doesn't press cleanly at high speed, you slow the process. If achieving the desired sound requires individual tuning, you tune individually. This creates exceptional vehicles. It also creates cost structures that don't scale easily. Manufacturing in smaller volumes means fixed costs distribute across fewer units. Hand processes mean labor content stays high. Limited standardization means supply chains stay fragmented. This way, you can build remarkable cars. However, it's significantly harder to build affordable cars or cars that maintain consistent quality across thousands of units. The economic consequences become structural. Process-driven manufacturers could profitably pursue volume. Design-driven manufacturers had to choose between maintaining volumes and accepting quality variance, or maintaining quality and limiting volumes. Most chose the latter, operating in premium segments where customers pay for exclusivity and tolerate occasional imperfection. Nothing exposes a manufacturing philosophy more clearly than how an organization responds to systemic defects. A recall isn't just a public relations problem, it's a stress test of organizational capability. When a process-driven manufacturer discovers a widespread defect, the response follows predictable patterns. Engineering teams analyze failure modes. Production teams identify the process gap. Quality teams verify that the fix prevents recurrence. Communications teams coordinate with regulators. The entire system activates with practiced efficiency because it's designed for exactly this scenario. Recalls are expensive and embarrassing, but they're manageable. More importantly, the post-recall period becomes an opportunity. The root cause analysis doesn't just fix one problem. It often reveals upstream weaknesses that create risk elsewhere. The organization emerges with stronger processes than before the recall. The failure strengthens the system. Design-driven manufacturers face recalls differently. When production volumes are lower and processes less standardized, identifying root causes becomes harder. When manufacturing relies heavily on supplier relationships and specialized techniques, implementing systematic fixes across the supply chain requires coordination that may not exist. The same flexibility that enables distinctive vehicles makes consistency harder to enforce. This doesn't mean design-focused companies can't solve problems. It means they solve them more slowly, at higher cost, with less certainty that the underlying cause has been fully addressed. The organization doesn't necessarily emerge stronger, it gets more careful, which isn't the same thing. Behind every production philosophy are people making daily choices under pressure. In a plant outside Nagoya, an engineer notices a slight increase in transmission noise during validation testing. It's within tolerance. It might disappear in production, but she files a report anyway, triggering analysis that discovers a supplier changed lubricant vendors without notification. The new lubricant meets specifications, but creates harmonic resonance under specific conditions. The issue gets corrected before a single production unit ships. That engineer doesn't become famous. She doesn't get celebrated. Her contribution disappears into the statistical noise of prevented problems, which is exactly what the system is designed to do. Process cultures reward people for catching issues that most organizations would never notice until they became catastrophic. In a design studio outside Turin, a different kind of pressure exists. A chief designer reviews clay models for an upcoming sports car. The proportions are technically correct, the aerodynamics are validated, but something's missing. An indefinable quality that separates competent design from memorable design. He asks the team to start over, knowing this delays the program by months and increases development costs significantly. Management isn't pleased, but he's betting that getting this right matters more than getting it done on schedule. Sometimes a designer is right, and the resulting vehicle becomes iconic, justifying every delay and every euro invested. Other times, markets shift, competitors advance, and a perfectly executed design arrives into a context that no longer values it. The gamble is real. Industries don't reward ideas on their own. They reward the infrastructure that allows ideas to be executed repeatedly at scale and under changing conditions. A beautiful car design is an idea. The ability to manufacture that design consistently at target cost across markets while meeting safety standards, training service networks, managing suppliers, and absorbing warranty risk, that is infrastructure. Infrastructure determines whether a company still exists 10 years later. Process-driven manufacturers built systems designed for volatility. Their production lines could flex across model ranges. Supplier relationships were based on long-term standards, not project-by-project negotiation. Workers were trained to understand not just their task, but how their task affected overall quality. Manufacturing capability wasn't something to be used once, it was something to be built and maintained. Cars were the visible output, the real product was the system behind them. That mindset created resilience. When markets shifted, they adjusted instead of panicking. When competitors appeared, they refined processes rather than racing to the bottom on price. When regulations tightened, adaptation wasn't a crisis, it was routine. Infrastructure absorbed shocks that would cripple less systematized organizations. Design-driven manufacturers often worked differently. Each model functioned as a distinct project. Suppliers changed, production techniques followed aesthetic goals, and quality depended heavily on individual craftsmanship. This fragmentation created vulnerability. Financial pressure couldn't be solved through operational improvement alone. It required higher prices, lower volumes, or external capital, each reducing independence. Over time, many Italian automotive brands experienced restructurings and ownership changes that Japanese manufacturers largely avoided. The irony is that Italian designers often showed extraordinary individual brilliance, but brilliance proved insufficient against systematic capability. In complex industries, organizations that improve predictably over time surpass those that rely on sporadic genius. The lesson is consistent. When complexity is high and mistakes are expensive, inspiration alone isn't enough. Process, the quiet, repeatable work behind the scenes, carries organizations further than moments of brilliance. Inspiration attracts attention. Process sustains trust. Infrastructure outlasts inspiration. Systems outlast genius. What you can repeat reliably matters more than what you achieve once brilliantly.